Oh, that'd be great. Thank you. I just got a six-pack. Saw me when shopping. Oh, no problem. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Our Lady of Mercy Parish here in beautiful downtown Leroy. My name is Brother Raymond. I'm one of the 3 friars stationed here in the parish. Please know that this is also being live streamed to those of you watching at home, as well as the people here in the church itself. Due to the nature of the program, it's a PowerPoint presentation, so if you want to move up to see the screen better, please feel free to do so. If not, we're free to stay where you're seated. We also welcome everyone who will be watching this later, because usually our live streams are recordable and you can watch it tomorrow, listen to it in your car, not listening to it tonight only. So to all those here in person and those watching live stream, welcome and thank you for joining us. This evening we are honored to introduce to you Dr. Thomas Carroll. Dr. Carroll practices general internal medicine and palliative care. He is an associate professor of medicine at the University of Rochester and is a longtime advocate for compassionate end-of-life care that aligns with Catholic teaching. In addition, he is a well-respected member of the Finger Lakes Guild of the Catholic Medical Association and was a presenter at their conference entitled Catholic Converged Conversations, Death with True Dignity, which was held at St. Bernard's School of Theology and Ministry. Dr. Carroll has also been featured on the New York State Catholic Conference of Bishops podcast, Capital Compass, where he was invited to discuss physician-assisted suicide. Dr. Carroll resides in Rochester with his wife and their 4 children. We are grateful for his time in speaking to us this evening. Welcome, Dr. Carroll.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Yes. It's actually one of the first introductions that I actually did not write myself. So yeah, that was very kind. Thank you. So thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to talk about end-of-life stuff from the Catholic perspective. And so I guess my disclaimer to this up front is I will promise to do everything I can to make sure that I'm always within the bounds of the church's teaching. And I think I am. Yes, I think so. Is that better? Okay, sorry. I'm working on it. Very well. So I'll always make sure that, if anybody thinks I say something crazy, please say so. And also, I never want to come across as flippant in any way. And yet at the same time, it's what I do for a living, and so sometimes I become a little too familiar with things, right? So if it seems that way, it's not intentional, truly. And as we go along, I really, at the end there'll be time for questions. I would invite them along the way too. Sometimes as we go along, it's easy to lose track of what we were wondering about in the midst of the talk. So please do just stop me along the way if you have questions. And I can sort of just go through this or some of what I have here, but we also can do a little bit of a choose our own adventure if you'd like. We can truly, if there's one of these topics or quite honestly something else you'd like to talk about, I'm happy to do that. So there's a guy who came recently to the university, and he's an unusual sort of grand rounds speaker. He was a poet and also an undertaker of all things. I will say my disclaimer is I do not endorse all of his poetry, but he said something really interesting during the talk, and he said, as a society, he said, I'm really happy to be here in front of you medical people, right? And he said, as society has lost its eschatological sense, the world has come to worship health, and doctors become the new high priests and priestesses of this thing, which I thought was a really interesting way of putting it, that as we've become more secular, I think, in this world, health is important, and yet it's become the end, if you will, like the ultimate goal for many people, I think, in the world. And one of the reason this kind of came to mind as I was thinking about tonight was that that's not the case for us. Right? It's truly not. There's plenty more beyond this life, and certainly after the second coming. And so just to keep that in mind. And then I was just listening to Heretics by G.K. Chesterton on an audiobook, and I love Chesterton. And he's talking about the loss of, I guess, wonder in the world. He said, if we ever get the English people back on English land, they will become again a religious people. If all goes well, a superstitious people. The absence from modern life of both the higher and lower forms of faith is largely due to a divorce from nature and the trees and clouds. If we have no more turnip ghosts, it is chiefly from the lack of turnips, which I thought was great. And it's funny, I didn't do this. I was really just sort of thinking, there's something true in that. And then I was driving here thinking, maybe I'm preaching to the choir. I feel like maybe people here are a little closer to the land, perhaps, than sometimes where I come from, even in the sort of rural part of south of Rochester here. But yeah, I think there's something about this loss of connectedness, both to the land, the true, like the soil, and to each other. As you know, everybody, one of the common things to point at is social media, and I think that's not wrong, right? Somehow we've become isolated by trying to be connected in this strange new way. And again, perhaps preaching to the choir in this, maybe there's more community here than I feel like has become normal for my life, and yet at the same time, I think that is the way the world has gone. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit for kind of what I'm thinking about anyway. And there's lots of nitty-gritty we can talk about, certainly. So, kind of just a general outline, and we can jump around. These are blue because they're little links. I can just click on them, and we can go anywhere we like. But thinking about end-of-life issues, we'll maybe start there just to sort of put it in perspective. Thinking about suffering, which is something I think about a lot in my work anyway. Palliative care versus and hospice, advanced care planning, ordinary and extraordinary care. And then I sort of added this one recently because this whole organ donation / brain death thing has become more and more kind of in my face anyway. Yeah, and there's a lot there. So maybe we'll start at the top just to have a place to start, I suppose. So there are a bunch of abbreviations on this, and it may be really, well, it's big enough, I hope, that you can read it. But I've sort of set it up so that on the right-hand side are the things that are more okay, and things on the left side are not okay, all right? And just to sort of put it out there that I don't know if these are terms that people have sort of run into or not in your kind of typical life. But there is really nice information you all have here. This little pamphlet, I just took a quick look through it, and almost anything with OSV on the back and the National Catholic Bioethics Center somewhere in there is good stuff. So take a look, and really, they, for just a little time I had to look at it, they really do a nice job of going through a lot of what we can talk about tonight with around pain management, the goal of pain management, the side effects, the extraordinary care versus ordinary care, and so on. And a lot of this is, encompassed sort of here. On the right-hand side of this, we know it's sad when it happens, but we can forego care that is overly burdensome, right? Whatever that thing is. And believe it or not, there was a time when you sort of couldn't, almost, at least legally. We can talk more about that. And then as we sort of move towards the things that are not as good at the other extreme is PAS, physician-assisted suicide, and euthanasia, these sort of things that are more and more in our world. Brain death, which we can talk about. So I don't know if that's helpful or not to kind of just put it on a spectrum a little bit. And please do, I would encourage you, stop me along the way if any of this sort of strikes a nerve, yeah. An excellent question, that's VSED thing, yes. So it stands for voluntary stopping eating and drinking. Yeah, sorry, yeah, and so it's been sort of touted as this quote-unquote natural, non-medical way by which someone might end their life. And this, I should say very clearly, is not the same as someone who's already dying of something and then loses their appetite. That's not it. This is where someone says, I am done living, and therefore I'm going to stop eating and drinking and cause my death, right? So it's morally, I would say it's not really distinguishable from the other things. And it's of particular interest to certain people in this part of the world, specifically New York State, I should say, because at the moment, fortunately, things like physician-assisted suicide are not legal. So people who want to avail themselves of that will often, find this by whatever mechanism a doctor will suggest it to them, and it's become an issue actually. In the hospital at Strong, where I practice at least my inpatient part of my role. Like the question, what do we do when people come to the hospital and want to do this thing under our supervision? And my answer is, I'm not going to do that, right? But my colleagues don't all feel the same way, so it's become a bit of a challenge in many ways. So yeah, thank you for that. All right, so we'll talk about suffering a bit, which is always a weird thing to put on a slide. Let's talk about suffering, right? But the question is, what is suffering and what is this thing? Because I think it's really important. I think it's important, number one, to recognize that pain is not directly equal to suffering, right? I think we all know that pain certainly can cause suffering. We've probably all experienced that. And yet, interestingly enough, I love this story. So I'll tell you the story, and then I think you'll see why I like to tell it. This came from the British Medical Journal. So this was in England, 1995. So that hence the quality of the picture. Remember when we used to have those things? Maybe you still have them. They were actually cameras, right? I think they took this with a camera that was not also a cell phone and other things. So this is a big tough guy, construction worker, had walked, jumped, something, whatever, onto a nail, and it went up through his, as you can see right here. That's his foot in a boot. He's in agony, right? They call the ambulance. They take him to whatever they call emergency departments there, the two countries separated by a common language. And he's en route, right? They're giving him IV narcotic pain medicine, and he says, okay, I feel a little better now, but he's still he's looking at his foot. They get him into the emergency department. They cut off his boot and find out the nail had passed between two of his toes, didn't even scratch his skin, right? Now, location. So the question is this, right? I mean, we laugh because it's funny. He was in real distress. He wasn't faking it. He wasn't malingering. He wasn't seeking drugs, whatever. He really, truly felt real pain. When they gave him pain medicine, his pain lessened, and yet there was no actual injury, right? So sometimes I say this, something along these lines to my patients, and the rejoinder or the accusation or whatever is, you think it's all in my head. And I say, yeah, in a sense I do. It is all in our heads. Like, where do you think we feel these things? where do we process that feeling but in our mind, in our brains? And as such, it doesn't mean that I can talk myself or think myself out of pain entirely, but it sure does mean that maybe a little bit I can lessen some of my suffering in ways that don't necessarily involve medications, not 100% usually. And it also means that I can go the other way, right? We know this also, that people who are depressed, they feel experimental discomfort. So this little thing that you can turn up the heat, right? Not to hurt people, but just to make it uncomfortable. Put it on their arm, and you can ask them, how depressed are you? And then you see what setting they say stop, or that's enough, or that hurts, however you rate it. And people who are depressed tend to say stop earlier at a lower temperature than people who are not depressed, right? So the way that we perceive the world and suffering depends on our state of mind. I think this horrible thing happened to me, if I'm depressed to start with, if I'm not depressed to start with. If I'm depressed to start with and then we fix the depression, the bothersomeness of the pain gets less, right? So this is important stuff to think about. Because all too often, sort of very reasonably, honestly, especially with the way we present the medical world to our patients, it's much easier for me as a physician to write a prescription than it is to talk about depression and how we can help you feel better emotionally so that we don't have to overdo it or do it more than we might otherwise with things like opiates. So, yeah, does that make sense? I think, yes? Okay. And all of this is easier said than done, right? I'm not saying this is easy to do and help people in that way. But the good news is that what's left over is not worthless, the suffering that is, right? There are a number of places, including like 1 Peter and other places, but I this one. I am now rejoicing in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am completing what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is the church. Thank you, St. Paul, right? It's an interesting translation. I think there are others, but I like the lacking, right? What could possibly be lacking in Christ's afflictions? Absolutely nothing, except what he leaves room for, right? Nothing can actually be lacking. He is the perfect sacrifice, and everything he did was perfect and sufficient and complete and superabundant. And yet at the same time, he leaves room for our suffering to mean something, right? And this concept of redemptive suffering, it's always I don't know why it's always the mothers. I guess it's always the good Catholic mothers. Offer it up every time you stub your toe or something. I always get nods at these kind of, yeah, totally. Because it's, I saw the mothers nodding and the husbands dutifully nodding, indeed. Yeah, and this is really important because otherwise it leads to what? Right? Unremitting suffering leads to despair. And despair is the lack of hope, which is literally among the worst of the sins, right? to despair against the cardinal virtue of hope is really something we don't want to do. And yeah, so there's always value in this in some way, shape, or form. And it's also, I think, worth recognizing that even in the midst of suffering, there's always the other side to it. There's joy and sorrow and suffering that exist side by side. They don't blend into each other. And here, actually, I feel like I'm stealing this from Chesterton again. They don't blend into each other, but they exist side by side, joy and suffering. And then what's pictured here are really the same scene, but two different things. The prophecy of Simeon and the presentation of Jesus, the first of which is a sorrow of Mary, and the second of which is one of the joyful mysteries, right? Despite the sorrow that's in there. And then the second one I like here is the loss of the child Jesus in the temple Jerusalem and the finding of Jesus in Jerusalem, right? Two sides to the same coin. One is listed under sorrows and one is listed under joy, right? And I say these things and most people are like, yeah, I know, I get it. And yet in the midst of suffering, it's much harder to keep this sort of thing in mind, I think, right? And I think therein lies the challenge. And none of this is to suggest that I'm particularly good at this. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty bad at it. I think my wife probably suffers better than I do. But it's hard, right? And at the same time, there was nothing when I signed the life contract, right? There was nothing about fairness or easy, right? That's sort of just the truth. And so I think it's really worth recognizing that yeah, these things, not only can they exist side by side, but they almost necessarily do. And then maybe one of my favorite stories of all time, at least in this neck of the woods as we think about it, is St. Lawrence. You guys know the story? He was a deacon, I believe, in the early church. First, like 3-digit kind of years, I believe. And the Roman, sort of local governor or whatever said, I know you guys have a bunch of money, you Christians. Bring me the riches of the church. And you know what he showed up with the next day was the poor. Oh, he didn't like that, the Roman dude, right? He did not enjoy that. So what did he do? He grilled him. And when we say grilled, we mean like somebody like really gave me a hard tongue lashing. They mean like on a piece of metal over a fire. Yeah, they like really grilled him to death. And he's famous for saying to his torturers, "I'm done on this side. Flip me over," or something to that effect. There you go. That's right. Flip me over. Now, I am not suggesting that any of us will actually attain this. And what is this but an amazing, I don't know if it's extraordinary in the proper sense, but it's an extraordinary grace, right? To be able to, be there. And what was he feeling? I guarantee you he was feeling the pain, and yet he had the joy because why? He knew where he was going next, right? He's not even going to skip off the surface of purgatory. He's just, straight there, right? He's dying for all the right reasons as a martyr, and he was able to articulate that in a way that I think is just wonderful. So, ideals to which we can certainly hope to attain with the grace of God. One of my least favorite lines of all time, if you can read that, it's, "There's nothing more we can do for you," right? I hope nobody's ever heard this from a medical type, but it certainly happens in the back rooms as we're talking to each other. You hear this like, "There's nothing more we can do for this person," right? And we don't really mean that, I think, in an unqualified sense. We don't mean there's literally nothing we can do. We usually mean something like, there's no more fill in the blank, chemotherapy, treatment for this heart failure, whatever the case may be. But man, oh man, I've heard people say this out loud to patients, to families, and it's just never true. Even on a very material sort of human level, there's always more we can do. Even if it's just skincare, right? Even if it's just caring for the person, is offering them water, right? The corporal works of mercy, there's always more we can do. It's just not the thing we wish we could do, right? We can't always fix the problem that it might be. If you hear this, the world, keep that in mind. And there's always more we can do. And I think this is where, just where I think it's really valuable to recognize that we do have the communion of saints, right? And this is part of what's missing, I think, from the world generally. Those who don't to this sort of doctrine. That we live on this horizontal level and there's a vertical level too, right? That we can still do something for those who have died, right? We can pray for their souls, of course. And once they make it, they can pray for us. We can ask them for prayers, right? I think my grandmother's probably on the right-hand side of this by now. I hope she is anyway, right? She was a lovely lady. She's died years ago. But I can, conditionally pray for her soul, and if you're in a position to do so, Grandma, pray for me, right? And so this idea that, I think we know this, but in the midst of suffering, in the midst of of death, it's hard to remember sometimes, and it's important for us to do that, at least in my humble opinion anyway. The alternative is this. I ran across this article today, actually. It was on the BBC. The man who turned his dead father into a chatbot. Here's what happened. His father, a few years back, this is like he's a tech guy, this guy who's pictured, this is the son, is working on artificial intelligence, right? Everybody knows AI. AI is all over the place. And yeah, his dad was a vibrant, healthy, kind of aging, but healthy sort of guy who was then diagnosed with something terrible. And so now the son is looking this future in the face, saying, I'm going to lose dad. And so what he did was he audio recorded him for like hours telling his life story. And then he did something that's sort of understandable in a certain way. He turned his dad into an AI avatar. So now he has this thing on the screen that's like dad's face, sort of-ish, and dad's voice pretty close, and you can talk to it. We should probably be careful not to say him, right? We can talk to this thing. But I think this is the alternative, right? We can't let go. We want to hold on, and we do want to hold on as humans. And at the same time, there's value in letting go when the time is right. Yeah, so this is creepy. Like, so here's another from the same article. They took hours and hours and hours of video of this guy here who then died, and the company called Deep Brain AI turned him into this sort of interactive thing in this bizarre, I don't know. But this is where the world is going, I fear, as we've lost, the bigger we, the sort of society, has lost a sense of the eschatological end of humans, which is ultimately salvation. So what do? I love this from St. Teresa. Pain and suffering have come into your life, but remember, pain, sorrow, suffering are but the kiss of Jesus, a sign that you have come so close to him that he can kiss you. Right? I mean, she knew suffering, like really knew suffering. Calcutta, the gutters, oh my God. Oh my. And yet, this is attainable, right? We really can do this. It's just really hard. It's just very hard. I hope that's, we'll get down into the details shortly, but I think it's important just to keep these sort of, these principles in mind. All right. So, from the 10,000-foot view, I guess, palliative care versus hospice. Are these, presumably everybody's heard of hospice, and perhaps palliative care. The distinctions and the differences and the similarities, is that something that's worth talking about, maybe? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Thank you. So they're similar, but they're distinct. So the hospice movement came over across the pond, right? It came from England, essentially. Dame Cecilia Saunders, I believe her name, who sort of started this movement in England, and then it came here. Started out actually in Connecticut, of all places, where I happened to do medical school, and then kind of moved across the country. And the idea in England, anyway, and it still is that hospice is a place. You go to a hospice, and it's a building, right, where you take care of people as they're dying, and that's the idea. In the U.S., it's sort of evolved differently, such that hospice is not technically a place. There are places, certainly. We have some brochures in the back. There are places called like comfort care homes. I'm not sure. There's one out here someplace, I think, right in Batavia. I forget the name of it. Aurora House is out here. Okay, Aurora House. Wonderful. So they're around, yeah. Crossroads, right. So there are places that sort of specialize in this. Those are rare, right? They're in the greater Rochester area. There are like 10 of them, maybe, and they each have 2 beds, right? Yes. So there are some other types of places. So there are some places that do hospice, but really at the base of this, hospice in the United States is a Medicare benefit. It's an insurance kind of mechanism by which we pay for the care at that part of life, if that makes sense, right? So the language really should be not that I'm, quote, going to hospice, but rather that I'm enrolling in hospice, right? So if I'm over 65 and I want to take advantage of the hospice services, I enroll in this sort of insurance plan, essentially, okay? If that makes sense. Now that comes along, there are some criteria. You have to have a terminal illness and check off the boxes, and this is where the 6-month thing comes in. And the 6-month thing is probably one of the biggest sources of distress, I think, when I talk to people about this. And I have good news. The 6-month thing is not what it sounds like. It's not a promise that anyone will die after 6 months or before. That's not it at all, truly. As a matter of fact, the way the Medicare regulations are is that they say you have to be more certain than not that if the disease runs its normal course, this person will likely pass away within 6 months. So first off, the disease has to run its normal course, which I don't always know what that means exactly, depending on what we're talking about. And also, more certain than not has been interpreted to mean 51%. Certain, that means. So if we enrolled 100 people and they all really qualified, 49 would live beyond 6 months, is the idea, right? So it's not a promise. Nobody ends anything on purpose after 6 months. And actually, interestingly enough, 6 months is not even a promise from the hospice end. After 3 months, you get reevaluated, and if you're doing too well, they sort of kick you out. You're always welcome to come back as time goes on. But yeah, so it's more fluid than that, and it's not as certain and definite as some people initially think. I say it's a Medicare Part A benefit. For those who know Part A, it's like the hospitalization benefit. It is the universal health care or health care coverage for people over 65. Whether you like it or not, if you're 65 or over, you have Medicare Part A, right? It just happens. Private insurance benefits sometimes, most probably, but not all, sadly. There are sometimes we run into folks who don't have Medicare, under 65, don't have Medicare, and yeah, sometimes they have quote-unquote coverage, but it's $75 a day or something, or $100 a day, which sometimes ends up just being kind of prohibitive. We're fortunate, I think, in this area, but also for sure in the Monroe County, that we have only not-for-profit hospices, and so they have a certain obligation legally to give away some of their services, and so this is what they do, right? They say the lack of ability to pay is not a reason to not enroll somebody. That being said, if you can pay, they ask you to pay, right? So there are some caveats there. And I would say the thing about the private insurance, just for what it's worth, is that I personally, and I'll bet you nobody else, has ever gone through their employer's health care choices and said, I'm going to choose this one because of the hospice benefit, right? So nobody even knows what it is in their own plan. I don't even know what mine is. I think it's good. I don't know. I'm insured by the university, so it's probably whatever it is. But yeah, it's just worth knowing that. So that's hospice. Palliative care, on the other hand, it's a specialty of medicine, and it did, in fact, palliative care as a specialty grew out of the hospice movement, right? So the first, I guess, palliative care doctors, at least in the U.S., were mostly those that happened to decide to care mostly caring the end of their life. What's happened now, though, is that palliative care has expanded so that if you're referred, I promise this is true, that if you're referred to a palliative care doctor, it doesn't mean necessarily that they think you're ready for hospice. Okay, so most people come to me, and there are two things. They're like, the only thing I think I know about palliative care is that you're going to tell me I'm dying and there's nothing more you can do for me, right? And other than that, I have no idea what you do, right? So to tell you what we do, I mean, we really will see anybody with a, quote, serious illness, whatever that is. We sometimes see people with truly chronic pain that don't have an otherwise thing that's going to shorten their life. But honestly, we're really not set up for that. Really, we're set up for folks who really have a very serious, potentially life-limiting, shortening illness. We really focus on two things, right? We do many things, but we focus on really, I categorize them in two ways, or into two categories. One is we do symptoms, so whatever's bothering somebody, and decisions, right? Trying to maybe anticipate what might be coming in the future, or perhaps there's a decision right now. Do I go forward with chemotherapy, heart transplant, whatever it might be, trying to help people sort of sort through it. And that's important. I think it's necessary for two reasons. One of the reasons is that you may have experienced this, anybody who's had anything to do with the medical world, that we spend, we go to college and medical school, residency, fellowship. It's like a 15-year process. And in doing that, English primarily is one of the things that comes out, right? We speak this medical jargon thing and we forget. And it's a natural thing, right? We forget what it's like to not know. And so oftentimes there's a difficulty just sort of getting the details across in a way that people can understand. But also, to be fair to the, let's say, oncologists of the world, they have an awful lot of details they really do need to deal with, right? And they have limited time, just like we all do, and also just limited energy, right? Between two people, there's a certain amount of like relational energy, and they just can't do everything. And so sometimes it really does make sense to say, you know what, I am a person, let's say when I'm got my palliative care hat on, who can take a step back. I'm not worried about the dosing of the chemotherapy, because quite honestly, I can't even pronounce the chemotherapies anymore, right? I mean, they're just outrageous. I have no idea what these things are. Because they come out with a new one every 3 days. I mean, I joke. I know generally what they do, or I really do, but I don't know enough to make that matter. So I don't even. That's just outside of what I do, and instead I can, weigh the positives and negatives of, these various things. Does that make sense in terms of palliative care? Okay. And for what it's worth, hospice is an organization, generally speaking. They often employ a couple of physicians, but I might be the hospice attending for a patient who's enrolled with hospice, and I might be that as they might have been my palliative care patient, perhaps they're my primary care patient. Doesn't really make any difference, right? I can kind of do this for anybody, and so can any other physician who feels comfortable doing that. So, that's palliative care. Just for what it's worth, actually, did I put this in here? Yeah, so when to call palliative care. So, I think I sort of talked about this a little bit, but there's this concept, mostly what we do in the medical world is the life-prolonging kind of stuff, right? Trying to keep our organs functioning in such a way that we will have a longer life and have fewer symptoms and side effects and such. But there does come a time where, as we move through life, the availability or the desirability of that life-prolonging care sort of becomes less. And that tends to be where something like palliative care as a concept sort of starts to take precedence in a way. And this doesn't have to be a specialist for what it's worth, right? The quote-unquote palliative care thing, it's hard to define in some ways, but we talk about, it's really something every doctor does in a certain sense, right? And so when you need a specialist, it depends on really just, the specific situation. But then just to contrast that with sort of what I already said, but in pictorial form, is that where you can have a sort of sliding scale of palliative care that can vary over time. Hospice is a yes or no thing. You're either enrolled or you're not, okay? And then when you get the care that's available through there. And then both palliative care and hospice continue to provide support even after the actual patient dies, right? Providing support to the family, loved ones. It's actually required by Medicare that a hospice agency provide 13 months, a year and a month, bereavement support, which makes sense. It gets you through the first anniversary of the death of a loved one, right? So that's available, which I think is really nice. Yeah, so we mentioned this a little bit. I do spend some time in the hospital. I also in the office. There are comfort care homes. The palliative care unit at Strong is very nice. It's actually, what you're looking at is the geography of the unit. That's usually where the nursing unit is, where the nurses are all doing their work. But on the palliative care unit, it's like a family area, and the nurses are kind of off to the side, which is kind of nice. It gives people a place to go that's not right in the room. There are some acute hospice facilities. This is, again, it's sort of in the Rochester area. The details there are not necessarily important, but they do exist. Comfort care homes, Mount Carmel House, I point out mostly because it's the Catholic one and I'm on the board. But lovely, and honestly, they're all really lovely, and they do a great job. The office for us is right at the cancer center, so that's where we physically see patients. Since the pandemic, it's actually one of the, silver linings is that we do a lot more, which has really expanded the kind of the folks that we can help, because it's hard to come in oftentimes. And then kind of home when it's necessary, right? We can in fact do home, and we do home visits, but there was that little interruption for a few years where nobody was doing that, but we're getting back in. That's kind of where we're at. Questions or anything about the, yeah? Good question, yes. So the question is, does palliative care provide help for families? It's funny, I was just having this conversation with a patient this afternoon. The answer is always a stock, yes, we do provide support. And then people say, great, I'd like these things. You're like, oh, not that kind of support. So yes, in the sense, we try to not forget about families. We try to include them. And when we're talking to the patient and families, making sure that we're providing support in that moment and thinking about things like caregiver burnout or whatever the case may be, right? That's really important. I wish I had minions. I wish I could send people places and be like, here's a bunch of help, but that's what we don't have, right? It gets confusing, though, I should say this, I suppose, that you might come to see me in the palliative care office, and then you're like, yeah, but don't you also work with those palliative care home people? And I say, well, they're separate. So the name gets used in all these different ways. But yeah, so the answer should be the same, at least from the patient perspective, regardless of whether you're seeing palliative care or some other specialist or generalist, whatever, that if you're a family member and you're supporting that patient in some way, please make your needs known, right? I think we sort of joke about this, in society generally, right, that as we get older and we're married and we sort of like become one, and in a sense that often happens to most people, right? I mean, the classic thing is like the husband or the wife has the relatively able body, but their memory's going a little bit, and the other spouse has the opposite, and they sort of they sort of work together in this way. And it's really worth recognizing, that one of the things that I do think happens is family members very nobly, I guess, put aside their own needs and sort of sacrifice in many ways for the person they are taking care of who has that illness. And that's valuable and important and laudable. And if it goes too far, then that person really does get burned out. They maybe get sick or they have their own problems. And then you can do nothing, right, to help the other person, right? So we do need to, as best we can, not create more victims, right? Like, if somebody's in the river, don't just jump in, because now you got to rescue two people, right? So to the best of our ability, we really got to help. I think one of our roles can be, and should be, to help people focus, the families and loved ones, focus on that person, that patient who really does need that help, while also making sure, to the extent that we can, they're taking care of themselves. So in that sense, making sure that we don't lose track of that is at least one thing we can do. Yeah. Does that answer the question? Okay. Thank you. Okay. Oh. So a palliative care plan working with the whole family or just the healthcare proxy? Yeah. Everybody. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about healthcare proxy actually next, as if you're a plant, but you're not in the audience, right? But yeah, no, it's really important to recognize what is a healthcare proxy and what they do and what they don't do. And yeah, so we'll come back to that. That's a great question. Yes, sir.
I see nothing wrong with myself, but I think it's wrong. But I come to understand, I don't fully understand the Catholic Church's stand on this, and that's what you were speaking tonight, that's still wrong.
All right. So the question is around, physician-assisted suicide, and specifically from the Catholic perspective, why the Church would say it's wrong. Is that fair? Is that some of the wondering? So I think one thing you're wondering is, why does the Catholic Church oppose, not support, physician-assisted suicide? Okay, fair enough. Yeah, let's talk about that for just a moment. I don't have anything specific on slides, but that's okay. So, well, I guess I sort of do. Let's do that. We'll come back to the advanced care planning thing. We'll take a few moments for that, because there's a question about healthcare proxies. No, it's perfect. So, one of the things you sometimes hear, especially around like feeding tubes in particular, but it might be any treatment almost that's like sort of keeps somebody going, is that, oh, he's Catholic, so we can never stop that thing, right? Oftentimes it is around feeding tubes. And the reason I'm saying this is because what you're asking, I think, is going to relate somewhat to this ordinary versus extraordinary care, and kind of what are we doing here? Where do these things go? So this is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, as you can see, the paragraph number 2279, that even if death is imminent, the quote-unquote ordinary care can never be stopped, and we're going to come back to what that means. That being said, we can use, let's say, painkillers like morphine or whatever one you want to pick, that knowing that this might actually shorten this person's life, and that can be okay, and we're going to come back to this, I promise. Well, I guess this sort of answers it. So long as death is not willed, right? So long as we're not trying to kill this person. And this is where the distinction, I think, does come in that's important. It sort of harkens back to Thomas Aquinas and others, right? Middle Ages. The doctrine of double effect, for those who have heard that term. St. Liguria, I believe it was, who helped to articulate this sort of thing. That so long as our intent is good and our mean.
But you have another situation there that I know that this father takes into consideration. That is, you have a family event case. I have 4 children. Okay, and they have to suffer through along with me in this. And the person who makes this decision is a man. He has to take policy to do not.
Making the decision about. So I guess I think what I'm hearing you say is that this sort of thing here, perhaps, let's just say it's written in the Catechism, because it is. I didn't put it in here, but there's a section on suicide, and it says suicide is never acceptable. That's what the Catechism says. I think what I'm hearing you say is that that's a man-made rule? Okay. We'll talk about that. Okay. So the comment / question is it the case that if we give enough morphine, it might hasten death? Under hospice, like above board, there's nothing else happening? Okay. The answer is yes. And I guess I wish I had a diagram, but the concept of double effect, it's actually, I think it mostly comes out of war theory and self-defense. Like, I'm allowed to defend myself if you attack me right now. My intent would not be to kill anybody, but if that person ends up dying when I defend myself, I can be justified, right? So I can cause someone else's death if I'm doing the right thing, and that's not my intent. So long as I am treating this person's pain, and that's my goal, and I'm using an appropriate means, morphine, let's say, because it does treat pain. It also treats shortness of breath, so whatever we're doing. And then another piece of this is it has to be proportionate, right? If I know 3 milligrams works and I'm like, well, I'm going to give 70 milligrams. Okay, that's no longer okay, all right? Because it has to be proportionate. So long as it's aimed at the right thing, it's proportionate. There might be what's called a anticipated but undesired side effect of respiratory depression and even hastening death, okay? Possible. That is acceptable so long as it's over there and I didn't mean it, and I'm truly intending the right thing and it's truly proportional and so on and so forth.
So as long as it's unintended side effect.
It has to be unintended for real, yeah. And I can tell you that I hear a lot of anecdotes, a lot of stories that I believe the people are telling me what they see as the truth. They say, Mom went on hospice and 3 days later she was dead, and the nurse just kept pushing the morphine. Okay. So when they've studied this, you look at 2 groups, 2 cohorts of people, those who enroll in hospice and those who don't. This is not randomized, okay, but it's just whatever. What you find out is that those on hospice live within statistical certainty, as best we can, uncertainty, whatever, they live just about as long as people who are not on hospice. So people on hospice are not, on average, dying earlier in these studies. Does that mean nobody ever goes in and gives them a shot of, no, it doesn't mean that, but that would be illegal in this state, actually illegal in every state in the United States. There's no state in which that's legal, and it would be it would be not above board, right? If someone does that, that's criminal. You're not allowed to do that. What I will say is, the reason I put it the way I did is that people who tell me these stories, I believe they're telling me something they believe to be true. They're not lying to me. I don't believe for a second. And, I mean, how many of these things have they seen, right? What is their expectation? It might be that mom was like gasping and horrifyingly and terrible. And it can even be true, and I tell you this is true. Okay, this is an anecdote. There's no data here. But I'm going to tell you, everybody that works on the palliative care like unit or in that sort of world will tell you that there's a spike in deaths like on Boxing Day, the day after Christmas. There's something about holding on. Even these people that are like almost comatose, it's like they're holding on, and when you let go, you die. So there's something about I'm horribly suffering, and my fight or flight response is up, 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 and you just relax that, and then I die. Did the morphine kill me or not? I don't know. I think we need to recognize that there's there's black and there's white. Oh man, there's a lot of gray in terms of that situation, which is different, which we're going to come back to the principles, which remain black and white, and I'm going to tell you why I think so anyway. But that answer, because it's a really important thing. And it is like one of the most common things. People are worried about, actually two different ends of the spectrum. People are worried that you're going to enroll me in hospice and you're just going to kill me, right? And then people on the other hand are worried like, you're not going to let me go, right? I mean, so people commit this like so different depending on the person. So, yeah, okay. So this is nutrition, hydration stuff, which we can come back to if we want. But I guess I do want to, just for a moment, directly address what gentleman here that said, this is a man-made law. And I will tell you, I'm open to correction, redirection. I once asked the question, I think innocence, this comes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. I asked, is the Catechism of the Catholic Church an infallible document? And somebody said, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, right? And the fact is I didn't. My understanding is this, that the Catechism of the Catholic Church refers to magisterial documents, and as such, any statement in the Catechism carries exactly as much weight as that magisterial document upon which it rests, okay? So, it might very well be, so people argue about the death penalty and the this and the that. I'm not a theologian by any stretch, and so I can't tell you which one is the right one. What I can tell you is that to the extent that I could bring up the Catechism on suicide, you can take my word for it, it says suicide is never okay, ever. If the claim is that that is simply a man-made law, I would argue that it's not. Because I think that is pretty well rooted in the magisterial authority, the teaching authority of the Catholic Church. So for me, Tom Carroll, to say I disagree with the church, boy, it really depends on what I'm disagreeing with the church about. Right? So you can disagree, anybody can disagree with me, but my understanding, to answer the question, my understanding is that the prohibition against suicide is not a man-made law, but it's rather an expression of divine law, as promulgated by the Catholic Church, the See of Peter, and all that other, everything else you might want to say about that. It is man who expresses it, and I think the Church would say it is divine law expressed by the proper teaching authority instituted by Christ in approximately AD 33, is what I think would be the answer to that. So the question is, the Baptists, Presbyterians, and other... I'm just repeating it so people can hear it, yeah. The answer is, I find it very hard to answer the question, what is quote, the Baptist Church think, because there is no centralized authority that is the Baptist Church. As soon as you disagree in the Protestant sort of world, you form a new church. When Catholics disagree, you form a new order. Right? So, or the Franciscans split, but they're still Catholic, still submit themselves to the teaching authority of the See of Peter, and that is exactly what this is. This is not made up. This is not me saying this is how it is, nor is the prohibition against suicide. That is, I think, is rooted in Catholic teaching as you're going to find, and I think it is more than man. Now, if somebody disagrees with me, that's a different issue entirely, but that's my understanding.
Well, would we go back to
Yes. Yeah, and so, I do think people, that we could probably go around about this for a while. I think the brass tacks sort of issue here is, do you believe two things? That the magisterium of the church can speak, and in doing so, it expresses divine law. And then, if we do believe that, the question is, did the magisterium say, in an infallible or at least authoritative way, that suicide is wrong? I think the answer is yes and yes for me. If somebody disagrees, I mean, that's probably more than I can handle right now. So I hope that at least addresses what I hope it clarifies at least the disagreement, at least, yeah. Yeah, so why is physician suicide a thing? Why do people want this? There are real data about this, and they come out of Oregon, because Oregon's been doing this now for like 2 decades, right? So, and they've collected reasonable data, and what they have is this: they have a sheet as part of the evaluation process. Like, so you go to a doctor, you say, "Hi, I'd like to die," and they say, "Okay, here's a sheet," right? I'm simplifying, and it's a check all that apply, right? And so it's like, why do you want to do this? And you know what comes out at the top? It's not pain. It's not pain. It's like loss of autonomy. It's being a burden. Being a burden is a huge one. It's loss of ability to go to the bathroom on my own. I kid you not. That's like in the top 3. Right? People say, we talk about delivering bad news. And what's the example we always use in the medical world when we're training residents is, you have cancer. And yet people will say that that's not a fate worse than death. The nursing home is a fate worse than death, people will say, right? Some people really mean that. Some are engaging in hyperbole, but nevertheless, it is not pain. It is suffering. And that suffering comes from places other than that physical feeling of my leg hurts or whatever the case may be. So it's mostly about autonomy, control, this concept of dignity, which they have macerated. Death with dignity, right, means nothing anymore. But yeah, that's what people really, I think, ultimately are afraid of or are actually suffering from.
I've done a little research on this specific to Florida, and if I understand this correctly, if you have a physician or a doctor that receives something following this all the way through, and you yourself administer whatever it is that's going to take your life, when you have a bad expectation, it's allowed.
It is legal in something like 9 states in the, whatever it is now, it keeps changing. A number of states in the District of Columbia, DC, yeah, it's legal in those places, but I think we can, I would say, as I stand here before you tonight, I think we can probably all agree that legal does not equal moral all the time. Okay. So, yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, the Catholics are big on authority. Yeah, I'm with you there.
You have to trace that back, and
right.
you really have the authority to say that.
Right.
Based on Jesus' teaching and his gift to Peter, the church, the authority did pass from him to Peter. And that's one. I think there's some color.
Yeah. That's one of them, absolutely. Yeah, the sanctity of life. No doubt. No doubt. So yeah, let's get it even more to this. Oh my, here it comes, right? So advanced directive. So this is something that probably is worth talking about in the last few minutes, if that's okay. Yeah. So people talk in the medical world. We talk about sometimes all these euphemistic things, these sort of jargony things like goals of care or someone's values or advanced care planning. They mean different things. These are not meant to be communication guides, right? We should not walk into a patient's room with that bright pink MOLS form, you guys seen this thing, this DNR form, and use that as the template by which I talk to people. Sometimes that happens in a way, but it shouldn't. These forms, the healthcare proxy, the living will, and the MOLS form, serve very specific roles that are sometimes abused in the world and sometimes really are important. So we're going to get to the healthcare proxy thing here too. So we're going to go through these forms just briefly. And please stop me again with any questions. I really do appreciate them. Let's go there. How about that? Okay, here we go. So I mentioned these terms, right? They're not equal. In fact, there's kind of a hierarchy here for what it's worth for my money. And the goals of care is kind of like the big picture. Like, really, what am I trying to get out of life? Usually as it relates to the medical world, if you're talking to me during office hours. Advanced care planning is kind of like what might I want or perhaps not want in the future in a sort of general way. But then the advanced directive, those actual forms, is how do we let everybody know that? Is kind of, do you see, like, does that make sense? Okay. Now, the thing about advanced directives is that they're pieces of paper upon which we write things, and so they do not take into account every possible situation, right? There's a guy who's now retired, he's a nephrologist who was in charge of the ethics committee at Strong for a number of years, and he had written this living will, advanced directive kind of thing he was very proud of, and it was like an algorithm that was like, if this, then that, if that, then this. I mean, it just went on and on. Okay, fine, but I mean, even still, it's going to be like, you're going to go scenarios A through X, and it's going to be Y when you actually get there. Darn it! Oh, curses. So, decisions, they're kind of two things, right? There's the who decides, healthcare proxy and such, and then what to do. So on the left, we have the healthcare proxy form, or part of it anyway, and on the right, we've got the New York State template living will. Just to make sure, in case I don't say this later, please don't use the living will. We have better ones. And I'm going to show you why in a minute. But it's the healthcare proxy that tells you who decides. Now, if I fill out a healthcare proxy and I list my wife, and then my mom, and then my adult daughter, or whatever, when it comes down to it, and I've lost capacity, I'm a comatose to make it easy, whatever, who decides? Well, they get the family together, and if everybody agrees, then we move on with life. Honestly, even if there's no healthcare proxy, everybody agrees, and it's not unreasonable what's being asked of us, we move on, right, and just do the thing. It's really when there's either kind of a crazy situation or when there's disagreement, right? If there's disagreement and the healthcare proxy says do A, and the crazy cousin from California says do not A, we do A, right? So that's like the legal power that a healthcare proxy has. That being said, to I think maybe address what you said a moment ago, even still, we don't exclude the other people, right? They're still family, just because they're not listed on this form or they're not the first one on the form. Oh, come on, right? Like, we should still be seeking consensus if we can, truly. Because the last, well, it's not the last thing, it's like the second to last thing I want is for somebody to go away feeling like their great aunt was killed by the medical system or by her daughter who I've never had a good relationship. You know, we do our best to try to find that consensus. At the end of the day, it does sometimes happen that person who's not the decision maker, not the healthcare proxy, despite all my best efforts, might not be at risk of me helping that person. They might just be whatever the deal is. I can't fix family stuff, right? That's happened for 40 years. And that's sad. We try to avoid that. So at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, it's the healthcare proxy. We try to avoid the shoving and the pushing, though, true. And we try to find common ground. I'm going to say one other thing about healthcare proxies and who decides. 30% of the time, I'm making that up, a substantial proportion of the time, when I say, hey, patient, there's nothing wrong with you right now, let's fill out a healthcare proxy. And they're like, I don't need one of those, it's my wife. I'm like, no, it's not. Did you know this? It's not your wife or your husband or anybody else. So prior to 15 years ago, whatever it is now, there was no law around this. If I became incapacitated and had never filled out a healthcare proxy, there was no legal coverage, if you will, to decide who decides. So we did the best we could. And then, some years ago, the New York State Legislature, in what I might describe as a brief moment of clarity, oh, this is getting recorded, isn't it? Oh boy. They said, look, we need something, so let's make it the next of kin, right? In this order, it is court-appointed guardian, which almost nobody has, and then spouse, if that person exists, and then adult children and parents, and so on down the line. All the way, believe it or not, crazy cousin from California is on that list. And you know where the next of kin list comes from? It's who will take custody of the body after someone dies. So it can even be like an interested neighbor who's willing to assume the cost of burial for that purpose. But here's the thing. When you do that, if somebody does not have a healthcare proxy filled out and we're going down that other route, they're no longer called a proxy, they're called a surrogate under the law, and that person doesn't have as much power, right? They do not have the unilateral power to make decisions about end-of-life kind of things. And if my wife, let's say, I don't have a proxy, but she's the surrogate because she's at the top of that list, if my mom disagrees with her, the whole thing falls apart. My wife has no standing Here's why. Ready? Out in the world, there are bad people. You guys know this, yeah? Right? Guess what? They're somebody's next of kin. Matter of fact, the horrible situation is the next of kin is the one that caused the person to be homeless. Right? Domestic violence, horrible things. There's no way that the person who's the perpetrator of domestic violence should be making life decisions for the person, right? You see what I'm saying? Hence, that's the best you can do with the law, right? Laws are blunt things, and that's the best you can do. So at least it gives us a place to start, but it is not, in any stretch, a replacement for this. Because now I've made a positive statement that's witnessed by two adults. That gives them, that person, the healthcare proxy, an awful lot of power. So be careful who you choose. They should love you, they should know you, they should be able to live without you, in a way. I mean, oh God, that's terrible to say, but if you got that person that's like really codependent in a really pathological way, like not good, they'll never turn it off when they should even, right? So you got to be careful. Somebody will like stand up for you and love you in that way, right? What's right for you. And then what do? Well, the New York State Living Will has progressed over time such that it's very easy to check off, I don't want these things, cardiac resuscitation, intubation, feeding tubes, and so on. So don't use that form, just don't, okay? I'm gonna describe a better option. I will, and lest anyone think that I'm pointing at you or criticizing anyone, it took me until I had 2 children to realize that the very lovely and well-meaning lawyer with whom we did our will, like our financial will, also had filled out a healthcare proxy and living will, which I knew, but then I realized what it actually said, and I was like, oh no, I had 2 kids. It took me, the doctor, that long to figure this out. Oh, I'm an idiot. So just be aware of what it actually says. Now, you actually can, on the regular old New York State healthcare, New York Advanced Healthcare Proxy, you can actually do everything you would really need to do for a living will, okay? Because the specific thing a living will addresses is artificial nutrition and hydration, okay? This is Nancy Cruzan, reportedly very nice, young woman in 1980, early 70s, 80s, who had a horrible thing happen. She was a car accident, face down in water. They resuscitated her, put her on a ventilator. Eventually, they turned off the ventilator to everyone's surprise. She continued breathing on her own, but now she was dependent on a feeding tube. And her parents said she wouldn't want to live like this. And the Missouri Attorney General said, too bad, we can't stop it because it's illegal to stop the feeding tube, mid-80s or so when this was happening. And so ultimately it went to the Missouri Supreme Court and then went, I believe, to the United States Supreme Court, and they said, okay, look, feeding tubes are weird, right? Feeding tube is food, but it's also medicine. So it's not like a ventilator, but it's also not like oatmeal, right? It's different in some way. So they said, what's required is the legal standard of quote-unquote clear and convincing evidence. Clear and convincing evidence, that's the phrase. And in order to determine that, in this case with Nancy Cruzan, they had witnesses, right? They had like friends and family, and so they had a Catholic priest come because she was in fact Catholic. And the Catholic priest said, yeah, under these circumstances you can stop this thing. And so the judge said, all right, we've reached our burden of proof, clear and convincing evidence, stop it. They stopped it. The court also, please stop, don't come back to us with more of these, figure this out, right? And so the result of that was all 50 states now have living wills, right? So that satisfies that legal requirement of, quote, clear and convincing evidence specifically about this. Why there's cardiac resuscitation on there? It's because of mission creep, right? It just sort of, why not? But really about this. So what we can write in this section right here, if you can read it from there, in order for your agent to make decisions about artificial nutrition and hydration, so on and so forth, they must reasonably know your wishes. And actually, this is one of the nice things about the New York State Healthcare Proxy, is there's a separate section in the instructions that says this. If you want your agent to have broad authority with respect to everything, including artificial nutrition and hydration, simply write, I've discussed my wishes, and including the last line about artificial hydration. And that just gives them sort of the power to make whatever decision it is they think you would want. Now, I would add, and please do it in accordance with Catholic teaching, right? Because I do want to put some boundaries around this. Now, my wife is lovely, and she would do only, she'd call our priest and be like, what do we do, right? So you can fix this problem by just doing one of these guys right here, now and at the hour of our death. I have no financial interest in this. I'm not selling it, I promise. But really, very nice. It has really nice teaching, information about what the church does teach around end-of-life issues, much like This is very nice, but it's right there. Like it's all in the same little booklet here, and it includes a healthcare proxy, and then immediately following what amounts to a living will. It says, you know, we need to do this ordinary thing, but sometimes it's burdensome and of no apparent benefit, so you can actually stop those things, including feeding tubes, right? I believe this is true. Saint John Paul II had his feeding tube removed before he died, right? It can be done. It's not that he's Catholic, you can never stop it. It's he's Catholic, we have a different threshold for stopping it than the secular world does. That's the answer here, right? If that makes sense. To make out an actual living will, you need a notary. So if you have the New York State template, it has a place for a notary public to, yeah. If you do this thing, it just requires 2 witnesses because at the end of the day, you're just sort of saying, this is my healthcare proxy and I'm giving them this extra authority. 2 witnesses, 2 requirements for the 2 witnesses. They each have to be adults, so 18 and over, and not listed on the form. So like if I'm the healthcare proxy, I can't witness my own designation. It seems obvious, but you'd be surprised what people do sometimes. So I think, honestly, for my money, healthcare proxy living will can be taken over essentially by this guy here, okay? If you're Catholic, do this, I think. Make sense? Okay. Yeah. Oh, good question. Yeah, so what if there's nobody? And this does happen. We have the sort of person who is either like the unbefriended, like homeless person, maybe, but also people who are just like, I love my family, but I don't trust them, right, or something. Is there a service? Not really, to tell you the truth. Not really. This does happen sometimes. Somebody says, look, my family's miserable, and I don't have any friends that I trust or I think would do this, right? So what do you do then? I think you talk to your doctor, and you say, here are the things that really are important to me. And this is where, honestly, we as Catholics, I'm assuming everybody here is Catholic, we as Catholics have a huge advantage because there is a magisterium. There is a thing that says, these are the rules, end of story, right? And that's a question of how do you apply that. But that can be done in a more sort of, another more clear way. Yeah, I've seen the occasional doctor act as the healthcare proxy, but they then have to not be the doctor anymore. They have to remove themselves from that. They can't be both. Yeah, most people say ethic. There's no law against it that I'm aware of. I wouldn't do it. Yeah, good question. Ooh. Huh. I know. Oh, leave me alone. Stop it. So yeah, so we're at just over an hour, and I don't know if how you guys are all doing, but yeah. How about we take questions? I will just say right to you. The MOLST form, that bright pink thing, careful, be careful, talk about it, don't just sign it. There are times when it's appropriate and a lot of times when it's not. So it really is a tool that can be used. It's just one of these things. This DNR thing is something we've got to be careful about.
Are you familiar with 5 wishes?
Yeah, 5 wishes, yeah. It's a nice worksheet, honestly, in many ways, I think. It's a nice kind of like worksheet to think through these things. Yeah. Right, yeah, so 5 Wishes is an online free, I think, right, free? I think it's free. Oh, it's not, you have to buy it? $5, $1 per wish. I mean, that's pretty good, right?
And it's a legal document in all 50 states.
I believe that's what they say. I'm sure they're right, yeah.
There are 4 states that you need not just a witness.
A notary or something, yeah, notary, yeah. Yeah, so it's a nice worksheet. Medical orders for life-sustaining care. Once upon a time, there was a DNR form. Believe it or not, I still have one patient who lives in a group home. I sign this thing like every 3 months. It just requires my signature, and now she's do not resuscitate. There's no witness. There's no consent. It's crazy. It's like, so this is an improvement in the sense it actually requires the patient's or the decision maker's signature with some witnesses, or you can do it verbally. Okay, fine. But at least it requires you talk to them. And I won't go through all the details, but it's actually, did I blow it up here at some point? I did. Correct. So this is one of my pet peeves is that colleagues of mine will routinely give this to patients and say, take it home and fill it out. And I'm like, no. This, as opposed to a healthcare proxy, which is like my statement about who I trust, this is technically an order, like the kind of order like give antibiotics in the hospital or check vital signs. So I will just briefly, the only reason this form exists is because everything in medicine, in order for us to do anything, you have to consent to it, like usually. got the poor woman going off for a C-section, and I mean, that's not informed consent, but that's what the lawyers require, right, that you do this thing. If I fall down right now, and you do this to me and I have no pulse, you're allowed to touch me without my permission. Please do. I'm not DNR'd, okay. You're going to try to get my heart started, and that's not battery. If I touch somebody without their permission, it's battery, like as an assault and battery, not good, don't do that. But if they're unconscious, I can try to help them. That's why these forms exist, because it's the one thing that we have to opt out of in the medical world rather than opting into. Does that make sense? So it's like, it happens unless I say no. And yeah, so there's intubation, mechanical ventilation, or do not do it, and some things in between. And then the top part there is the CPR, do it or don't do it. And honestly, we need this kind of form for people for this procedure if CPR does not make sense, because even you can have I could go down right now, my wife could walk through that door. She's the most informed healthcare proxy of all time. She loves me, she can live without me, all those things. She can't make a decision about this. It's like seconds. How could you possibly make an informed decision? So this has to be decided beforehand, right? It really does. So it makes sense. And I think when most of us are young and healthy, oh yeah, go ahead. It's supposed to be reviewed every 6 months. Somebody's supposed to, there's this, like the third and fourth pages have a place to update it. I'll tell you, if it's not updated and reviewed, it'll still get used. Yeah, it will be used, yeah. So when I'm healthy and 21, if I go down, like there's a reasonable chance you could get me back, right? So it probably makes sense. If I'm 102 years old and sick, real sick, when I die, it's not because I have a deficiency of CPR, it's because I died. Okay? I'm allowed to die, we know this. So somewhere between 21 and healthy and 102 and sick, if I'm fortunate to live long enough and there's no bus involved that I just die, it goes from, it makes sense to it doesn't make sense at some point. And so our job, I think, is to sit down with people and help them figure out which side of that line they're on. And it's not based on age alone, it's not, it's a complicated thing, but it's worth recognizing that there does come a day, if we're live long enough, we get sick, maybe this doesn't make sense anymore, and it's okay. The thing we have to be careful about, I think, is that, again, it's not that as Catholics, it's not that we shouldn't ever do not resuscitate. That's not the case. It's just we have a very different threshold if we're doing this, what I think is right, based on our faith. We're going to have a different threshold than a lot of the secular world at the end of the day, is really what it comes down to. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. And I will tell you, there is this thing that happens when people get admitted to like a nursing home, where they say, you have to have one of these. And it's not untrue, you're supposed to have one of these, but it's not required that you do not resuscitate. That's not a requirement, it's just not. So the fear and the thing that does happen, I think sometimes, is that you're signing all these forms, there's like a pile of, it's like buying a house, right, to move into a place, a facility of that kind. And sometimes the pink form is just one of them, and you're just, so just be aware, be careful, be like, whatever, you're not going to throw me out on the curb because I take an extra 5 minutes to sign this paper, right? Are you? Maybe, if you are, maybe I shouldn't go here, right? But, yeah, does that make sense? Okay. So originally, that's what this was all about, this DNR thing. Then, like the like the living will, it sort of expanded. So now there are things like feeding tubes, antibiotics, and dialysis. I can tell you, I've been in codes, I've run codes, right? Head to the bed, all that dramatic George Clooney ER stuff, right? It's going on. I've never said, quick, get the MOS form, figure out what they want to do with the feeding tube. It's not an emergency, right? But they put it on here because, I don't know, I guess you can figure out what you think their motivations are, the bigger they, whoever's doing this. But I'll tell you what did happen recently, because I want to give credit where it's due. This is a new form, a couple of years. The old one, if you look at this, where the top, what's the top answer here? The top checkbox is long-term feeding tube, like do it. The bottom choice is no feeding tube. It used to be flipped over. And, humans being who we are, we tend to go with the first thing we see, right? So it used to be, the default was DNR and then full code. Do not intubate and then do intubate. Do not use a feeding tube, and they flipped it over. So it's actually the more aggressive thing is now on top, which is an interesting change in a state that's not exactly pro-life. So yeah, interesting, right? So a little credit where it's due. I know why it's on the form, I think, but it shouldn't be in my humble opinion. But nevertheless, there it is. So just be aware of what it is, and it's always worth a conversation. And if you're ever really, really wondering, yeah, I'm available, truly, like reach out. If you go to I should have. Right, which sort of makes sense, right? Like, yeah, like, well, should we use antibiotics? Well, I don't know. What do you... Now, there does come a time where you might say, look, feeding tubes just aren't going to help me. Like, Usually it's not me saying that, because by the time I'm that sick, it's somebody else saying it for me. But there do come those times. We know, it's so sad, right? But we know that people dying of cancer, if we put in a feeding tube and we do the calculations and we give them however much nutrition and hydration we think they need, they do much, much worse. They have more symptoms, need more pain medicines, whatever, because the fact of the matter is that dying body cannot use those substances, which is different than somebody who has a laryngectomy, right? They take out, I mean, my body's fine, I just have a roadblock, right? Of course, in a feeding tube. Dementia, stroke. What do we do with feeding tubes? I think it's worth, this is a total gray zone. The dementia thing in particular is very, very difficult, because I agree that it doesn't feel right that they're not eating, and at the same time, they're not eating in part, well, why? You wonder, right? Is it because when they do that they blow up with fluid, or is it because they forget? I mean, if they forget, we should prompt them. If they say, no, leave me alone, I mean, should I be forcing it into them? These are truly case-by-case situations. I will tell you that no matter what anybody in the medical world says, we do not have good studies about this. Because can you imagine trying to do this study? It's hard to, we're putting in a sham feeding tube, and would you allow your loved one to be randomized to feeding tube or not? I mean, come on, right? We're not going to do this. So no matter what anybody says, we just don't have good data. So what we are in this gray zone where the morals and the values and like the individual decision making really is valuable. So there we are. Yeah?
The classic is always talk about morphine and the life. Why not, or is like buprenorphine used to that same extent, which seems to have less of those unintended side effects?
Yeah, good question. So morphine versus buprenorphine, otherwise known, or at least in some formulations, as Suboxone and other things, right? So very briefly, Suboxone, buprenorphine is an opioid, similar to morphine, but it tends to not have as much respiratory depression. There's kind of a ceiling on the respiratory depression effect, if you will. It's also not as good a painkiller. It's just not. So everybody said, the trouble is this, like morphine, all these names have some baggage attached to them, and I'll tell you what they are. Morphine kills everybody in hospice and on the battlefield in World War II. Dilaudid, everybody gets addicted to. Same thing with oxycodone. Fentanyl kills everybody. Methadone's only for heroin addicts, right? I mean, we can go through all of them. But the fact of the matter is, we can use all of them safely. We really can, under control. The reason fentanyl's killing people is because they don't know they're taking it, right? They think they're sniffing cocaine, and in fact it is, but it's also got a bunch of fentanyl in it. If I put a fentanyl patch on somebody's arm, we know exactly how much fentanyl is going on, right? So all of these emotional baggage things are very real, and I get it. And if somebody says, look, somebody or other loved one died of a fentanyl overdose, I cannot imagine ever accepting fentanyl. Fine, we'll do something else. That's okay, I get it. And I'm not going to force that on anybody, of course. But I run through those things because I do this all the time. Because if we reject out of hand something because of some sort of preconceived notion, then we're just tying our hands in a way that might actually hurt us in the end, so. All right. Well, I think that's probably most of the time we've got. I thank you for doing this. Otherwise, oh God, I hear myself talking all the time. So no, thank you truly for asking questions, and I appreciate everyone's thoughtfulness and including challenges. I don't mind being challenged. I like it. So thank you all for coming tonight, truly. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you. And for your attention and interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll, for your presentation. We thank everyone for coming, both here in person in the church and folks who are joining us via live stream. There are baskets and such in the back of the church with the booklet that the doctor mentioned in his talk, so feel free to take one home. And have a good evening. Safe travels. Get home safely. Don't hit any deer on the way home. Thank you.
Can I answer your question?